Hello, my name is Xenophon Papadimitris. I'm a professor in radiology and biomedical imaging and biomedical engineering at Yale. This interview is part of a collection of conversations with experts in medical software from academia, industry, and regulatory agencies, and is supplementary material for a Coursera class Introduction to Medical Software that will appear in the fall of 2021. Guest today is Andinet Enquobahrie, who's from Kitware. He's there as the director of medical computing. And, disclosure, he's an old friend. We've had many conversations over many years. And Kitware is an interesting company in that they are one of the first companies that built in this space on the open source model. Joining us also is Anne-May Little, who's a rising senior in biomedical engineering at Yale. And Anne-May is one of the students helping out with the creation of this class. So I'm happy here too. So with that, Andinet, you can tell us a little bit more about you and Kitware. What do you, both as you as a person and the company, do?
Invitation, and I'm very happy to be here. As you said, Kitware is sort of, we have, an interesting business model. In fact, when we started back in 1998, making a viable business by just giving away your software was, sort of a strange thing. Is because, the software, even the medical software industry at that time involved around building software, but keeping it closed source, making proprietary, and then make money by selling license fees, right? So we're sort of, I would say, the trailblazers in building a company around open source software for advanced research and development for scientific computing. Obviously, Red Hat already started in the early 90s by then, and people have already started understanding the whole open source business model, but that was mainly for operating systems, right? So we build different software. I would call it for scientific computing research and development. And in the company, we do have about 4 or 5 focus areas. There is the data analytics one, scientific visualization, software processes, computer vision, and then the groups that I'm leading is the medical computing group. So in the medical computing group, we build software like 3D Slicer, ITK, and we also contribute to VTK, ParaView, CMake. These are all powerful, high-quality software libraries that you can use to build different, medical applications. So personally, I am a computer engineer by background. Got my PhD from Cornell, like 15 years ago. And then since then, I've been also doing more of having this management role, leadership role, and I am involved in leading different research projects at Kitware around, I would say, image-guided surgery, medical image analysis.
Okay, thanks. So let's stick with the theme of open source. It will be the core of the conversation. Yeah. That's the core of what you guys do in any event. So Kitware is an open source company. If you went back 25, 30 years ago, open source was a synonym for cheap and poor quality, and not the thing you would want to touch in any kind of mission critical setup. Obviously, this has changed with Linux being the flagship open source project in many ways. How has it changed? How has the acceptance of open source changed over the years, and how, especially in the medical domain, in the medical device field?
So, as you point out, when people think of open source, at least, 20 years ago, the understanding is if it's free, it's cheap, right? If it's free, it's low quality. So we used to say it's free, not as free as beer, right? It's actually free because, people have invested a lot of their own time and energy, and also government agencies have provided a lot of funding for developers to be able to build this software. So that's why it's open source and free, is because people have put in a lot of investment around it. Now, but the key part was even though if it's open source, there's got to be high quality sort of, professional level software development processes behind it, right? And that was critical for us, starting from VTK, ITK, CMake. It was not something you build overnight and just, put a zip file on your website and just give it for people for free. But there was a lot of high quality software process behind it, right? And in many ways, our goal was not just support the academic researchers or university research centers, but also commercial companies. And so if you're like a startup company building a medical device software product, you care about quality, right? So we made sure we have software processes and tools in place to every development that's gonna come out is high quality, right? It passes all different testing infrastructure, verification, and validation. So people have started to realize that, and I'm sure we'll get into it, which is if you are starting a startup company, building a medical device software, how do you go about choosing the right type of open source libraries, right? And as people are realizing that there's this open source software, uh, there is this high quality software involved, and people are able to do their own evaluation. So they've started to adapt it. They've started to understand the value this open source software provides even in commercial applications.
I've noticed that students often get an introduction to our software, either in their classes or in their research labs. Can you elaborate how this benefits students?
So that's a very good question. Again, going back to like 20, 25 years, when we were in university, a lot of image analysis classes use MATLAB, right? MATLAB is a very, very powerful software with license, but it has a license fee. One of the things you realize when you come out of university is a lot of these very powerful software, they're very expensive, right? So like, if you start, join a startup and say, hey, I've used MATLAB for the last 5 years doing all my course project work, I need MATLAB here. And then you'll find out, again, I'm not bashing MATLAB, but I'm just using it as an example. It's very, very expensive because universities get a huge discount, obviously, because it's very powerful tools. But now a lot of this open source software with no license fee, university students are started to using them for their course project work or capstone project. And the advantage of that is when as soon as they graduate and join the industry, they have the software tool experience and expertise that they can use in their industry work as well, right? And also professors have started planning and organizing projects and course homeworks around this open source software, because they're also understanding that they're powerful and these are really high quality software. And then any experience that their students would get working on those projects using those open source software will make them valuable, right, after graduation. And then they would be, day one when they start working, they actually can be involved in product development and do a lot of, really good work.
And actually, I've seen many companies look at students' contributions to open source projects also as a way to build a resume, right? So if you've been involved in VTK, ITK, that gives you a heads up in the medical device industry, because it shows that it's a way to demonstrate expertise of great coursework.
Yeah,
like
absolutely. I mean, for example, when we hire people at Kitware, we spend a lot of time on looking at their GitHub contributions, because people could be really good at interviewing and answering questions, but nothing like looking at their contribution to the open source community. A lot of, Xenios, a lot of the hires we made in the early stages of Kitware, most of them came from the mailing list, right? So you have a student doing his PhD, working using VTK, and then as soon as they finish, we will reach out to them and say, hey, you're a good VTK expert. Why don't you join Kitware and work on several interesting projects? And and then even now we do that. And so yeah, so I agree. It's a good way of, even for employers, it's become a very good, realistic, practical way of evaluating new applicants.
So when we talk about open source, the original license was sort of the GPL, and people have this idea of like a viral license and things, which of course is not the thing that industry likes to see for obvious reasons, as you will explain, I'm sure. But that's where the Linux came out as well, right? That is the best known in many ways. But let's talk a little bit about commercialization and open source and licensing, and what do people need to be careful about? And also, I guess, for students, it may be helpful to talk about the implications of that for your own work if you release as open source too.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I mean, it's still, even to this day, when we get a call from a customer who is, one of the things we do at Kitware is research and development, and do some custom application development. The very first question they would ask is, you guys gonna use VTK to build this application? What's the license fee? Who am I paying that license fee, right? Or the question, and there's always this sort of, I wouldn't call it stereotype, but the fact that if it's somebody that already developed it and made it free, available to everyone, people would assume, oh, there must be a catch, right? If I download this open source library and integrate it into my medical device application and then start selling it, are they going to come after me, right? And that's why it's so important you carefully look at the license term, right? And I kind of broadly, you can classify the open source licenses into two groups, right? One is what we usually call permissive type of licenses, like Apache, BSD, MIT derivatives. The reason they're permissive, they're less restrictive, is that if you build a commercial application on top of that open source software, you can still keep it proprietary, right? For example, take VTK and ITK, you build, let's say, a radiology workstation on top of that, and you want to sell that, the whole application can stay closed source and proprietary. And that's important, obviously, because those companies have spent a lot of money and investment. There's some business value that's going to be added to it, and that can stay closed source. And then the second type of license, which is very, very important as well, is what's called copyleft, like the GPL type of licenses. Now, those type of licenses, the reason they're sort of termed restrictive is, if you build or modify the software, then you have to release that software as open source back to the community, right? So obviously, this is good it's important in universities, research communities, where you've sort of benefited from that already existing open source software. So anything you modify, any value you add to that open source software, you have to give it back fully. So, but for us at Kitware, obviously our focus is not only research, but also commercial applications. Because of that reason, we made the decision from the very beginning that all the software that we're building has to be permissive and usable for commercial customers, as well as researchers and even students or in education. So, and again, one of the things we always talk about is when customers or new medical device companies build an application, they have to carefully look at their software stack, right? Okay, what are the libraries that you're using in that application? Obviously, there is always pressure to get a product out the door. So you'll go online and you download, a particular library and you start integrating it to your whole application without really paying attention to the license terms. And that can cause a lot of pain later on, because once, let's say if it's a GPL, a GPL license library that you included, that can have this, as you said, Xenios, a viral effect, which means everything that you've built, have to be open source. Obviously, we're talking about the two extreme cases. There are a lot of different licenses in between, like LGPL and all different varieties. But it's obviously an important thing to keep in mind when you use open source software for commercial applications.
Just to add one more little thing before I turn over to Anme. People, of course, say, well, people will take your code and they will never give you anything back. But VTK and ITK, even though they have this very permissive license, you get a lot of input and feedback from companies who use it and find mistakes and bugs in there. So you get contributions even though you don't enforce contributions, right? There's sort of an honor system in some ways. It helps these tools grow.
Exactly. And then this is sort of in line with what's a software, right? In this day and time, right? Software is a living document. It's never done. And the advantage of having this software out there, people testing it, it's actually a good way people would use it and try it out and then provide feedback. And then in that way, the quality of the software gets better and better, right? And again, it goes back to what we were saying earlier. One of the myths around open source software is, well, if it's free, it's low quality. Not really. I mean, if you have a software process in place where every contribution is documented, well tested, you're actually going to benefit from thousands and thousands of developers all over the world, testing and providing the feedback. So it has a lot of value in making this available. So people who are using the open source software benefit, and then also the maintainers of the open source software will also benefit from all the users all over the world.
In this course, we learn a lot about software regulation. So what are some of the issues of regulating open source libraries, and how do you choose what makes open source?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So obviously in mission critical applications like healthcare, you have to be careful about what open source libraries you use in building your application. So the key here is every regulatory body, they do have guidelines and processes in place. In many ways, for them, if you take FDA, they don't have any prescription in terms of whether you have to use only closed source or you have to use only open, or they don't say, oh, don't use open source, because they don't make that prescription, because the most important thing is for that software you build, what are the processes around it to obviously verify, validate, and all the risk assessments that you have to put in place. And for example, when we get a lot of customers who are interested to build a commercial application on top of our open source libraries, the question that they always ask us is, can I use it for an FDA for an application that I'm going to apply for FDA, right? And it's open source. What does that mean? And we, what we try to advise them is, yes, I mean, obviously you got to go get a regulatory consultant, because we're a software company. You need to have a consultant who can help you. But the most important thing is, put in place the processes that are needed to be able to use that software. So obviously, besides the regulation requirement, you also have to be careful how you choose which open source library that you're going to include in your application. Okay, so let me elaborate a little bit on that. So, how do you, so this goes back to the question, how do you evaluate an open source library, right? Obviously, you're interested in that library because it does, particular function or a particular thing that you were looking for, right? Let's say you're looking for building a 3D visualization for your medical image software. So you go out and look for, all right, what are the visualization libraries out there open source, right? So the things I would advise people to do is, one, kind of take a look at, what's the history of that library, okay? The level of activity is important. Well, what does that mean? I mean, in many ways, if it's a GitHub hosted software, you can look at, the number of committers, how long it's been around, the level of activity, and also you'll get a sense of who is maintaining it, right? Is it just a one-man show, or is it like, an ecosystem of different groups and industries involved in maintaining that software? And then obviously what we just talked about, the license is going to be huge, right? In many ways, we usually, the very first thing you want to look at is what's the license. If it's GPL, it doesn't matter, especially if you're looking to build a commercial application. You won't be able to use it, right? So that would be sort of one of your decision criteria, right? Is if it's GPL, then you're not going to include it. So looking at the license, looking at the ecosystem that's around that open source software. And also, in particular, when you look at the ecosystem, and we get this question a lot, for example, 3D Slicer. So 3D Slicer it's a turnkey GUI application for doing image analysis and image visualization. People would come and ask us, can I use it to build an FDA approved application? And we say yes. I mean, obviously you gotta follow there are processes that you have to follow. Now, the next question we always get asked is, are there any other companies out there who are actually using it, right? And that becomes tricky because obviously those companies, for different reasons, they might not be, disclosing that information publicly, right? One is, for example, they might feel, because there's still some sort of thinking out there where if you use open source software, for patient care, right, patient management, people assume, man, this thing is, you're building this whole application from a free, low, open source software. People think that the whole application is still kind of low quality, right? Because of those reasons, I mean, for example, we know a lot of companies in the US and all over the world that are using ITK, VTK, 3D Slicer. But if we reach out and ask them, hey, can you make a public declaration that this particular proprietary application you're using actually is taking advantage of or using, I wouldn't, taking advantage, not the right word, but it's based on open source software, they're usually very hesitant to do that because of those reasons. So now what we've been trying to do is, there also you come across companies who are very willing to do that, like very willing to say, hey, my application is based on these open source libraries. And if if one of those lucky open source maintainers where you have commercial customers who can make that public declaration, then you can make that information also available on GitHub, right? So, and that gives people confidence, right? It's like, oh, if I have this 5-year plan to work on this medical device software product, and I'm planning to use ITK, and then I know this company is already using it. This is a very large company, very successful, with a huge customer user base, and people will say, okay, this is something I can be confident with. And lastly, before I finish, in terms of this question, is one of the big thing right now is cybersecurity, right? And this is obviously it's in everybody's mind right now. And in fact, even at FDA, when you submit an application for any sort of FDA approval, cybersecurity is one of the key expectations in terms of what are the processes you have in mind to handle any sort of security issues or cybersecurity issues. And again, it depends if your application is a web-based application. I mean, it's even worse, right? And there's a lot of things you have to keep in mind. Even desktop applications, right? Something you can just install on your machine. There is still a lot of vulnerabilities that you have to be careful about. Different sorts of risk management, penetration testing, and they're all different testing mechanisms that you have to put in place in your software application. And then just last thing to add, the medical devices are also becoming smarter, right? A lot of them are Wi-Fi based, Bluetooth based, then which means the chance of people hacking into your system or hacking into your device is even higher. So this is also becoming a very critical aspect of medical software development. I think I would say 15, 20 years ago, the focus has been verification and validation, right? Does this software does what it's supposed to do? Is it gonna cause any harm to the patient? As long as you take care of that, you're good to go, But now you have to add these cybersecurity issues also on top of your validation process.
Just to touch, I think that was left unstated, Andinet, I guess. Part of what you implied with cybersecurity is that having access to the source actually helps you audit for cybersecurity, right? If you're using a library that you don't know what's going on, it's hard to know what processes it's running. Part of auditing for cybersecurity means knowing what's inside your code, and open source helps it.
Exactly. And again, it goes back to what we said earlier, which is there are thousands of developers' eyes looking at your source code, right? And which means you will find someone from, somewhere on the other side of the world looking at a particular filter or a very small implementation in this, millions of lines of code and identify, some, vulnerability there, and that helps as well. But obviously, it goes both ways, right? People can also identify those vulnerabilities and try to take advantage. So, but as again, as part of your product development, and I think this is very important, you have to take a particular version of what's already available on the open source community and lock down that version, and then do your lot of internal testing, right? Because obviously it's open source, it's going to continue to be changed, it's going to continue to be modified, and that's not going to stop. But in fact, this is one of the requirements from FDA anyways, which is it's okay, you can use open source library, but they want you to lock down a particular version of VTK and ITK, and then put together a testing infrastructure around it, and then rigorously test that particular version, right, internally. and that's going to be part of your product development. The cybersecurity is going to be one of them. So, but then let's say you're thinking about new features of your product moving forward, and if you want to update to a new version of ITK and VTK, you still gotta make sure you pass that version through a rigorous testing and validation.
Actually, just to give an example for people, as part of my consulting lab, I had to run Osiris. Osiris is a well-known medical image viewer. Osiris, of course, is built on VTK, but we had to figure out from them what exact version of VTK they were using so we could link to it. And it came down to, this is the GitHub hash we checked out. It was some unofficial in-between release that they had standardized on. It wasn't like a formal release. It was kind of interesting, tracking down the exact hash so we could get the exact version of the library. But that's how people do it. Let's transition a little bit more technical now. So yes, in general, we've heard about how you use it. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. So part of what the FDA wants and other regulatory agencies around the world is design controls. If you're designing your device, you have to follow certain procedures. Obviously, open source software doesn't have exactly that. There is no quality management system attached to an open source project because nobody would follow it. I mean, but somehow you have to incorporate this open source into your quality management system as a company. The mechanism is comes by the acronym of SOUP, Software of Unknown Provenance. But of course, there are different kinds of that. So if you can just talk to us a little bit about how open source fits into that framework of the standards and of that type of vocabulary. What do you do to qualify it effectively at a more granular level?
Yeah, so, well, yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. And for example, if you take VTK, let's say visualization toolkit, and it's a software that's being built not with just a medical application in mind, right? It's a visualization library. You can use it for, visualizing data from oil and gas, for energy, or you can use it for security defense. So, I mean, medical is just one application. So now, when you have that type of software like VTK, when the software is being built, it's not, it's first of all, it's a toolkit. So there's also a distinction between a toolkit and an application. So a toolkit is just it contains implementation of different functions. Now, to build an application on top of VTK, then you have to connect the different filters. You have to connect the different pipelines to build your application. So even though like VTK and all other open source libraries that we're maintaining at Kitware goes through, have testing infrastructure. So we have what we call CDash. This is a dashboard, a web-based application where you can monitor the current status of all the different tests, compilers, build options that you have, which is being tested on different computers and compilers. That helps to with that particular toolkit and with that particular filters that you're implementing, right? Now, but then when you're building an FDA application using, let's say, VTK, just to give an example, you're going to be starting out to identify and start documenting, design controls, requirements, and specifications of your application using that VTK library. So in many ways, you can use SOUP and other types of off-the-shelf libraries in your medical application, even though you didn't implement it or also not implemented for medical application. But as long as when you're putting together an application and you have, one documenting the specification and design, putting together a risk assessment of that, of that particular library. For example, the companies that we work with that use VTK for your product application, one of the things they will do is they will take VTK, but then they will build this, validation tools around it. So they have, for example, VTK is a visualization software. So they, for example, they will use phantoms and other objects with known dimension, right? And then they will then visualize that particular object using VTK, and then they can quantitatively evaluate the quality of the visualization based on that phantom, an object of known size that they use. So they're not directly going in and then individually testing the filters, but then by just integrating VTK into that one module, they can have that, right? And that's acceptable by FDA, and a lot of companies do that. But then the key, as we talked about earlier, Xenios, is the version that you're using has to be locked down, right? Okay, I'm using this particular VTK version, and I've got this testing infrastructure in place. And as long as you have your testing infrastructure, metrics, traceability, and everything correctly aligned with that particular library, then you'll be able to. I think you won't have any issues with FDA. Obviously, I'm not FDA expert or legal consultant, but I'm just speaking from the experience we have working with commercial customers.
And for the students here, in some ways, the reputation of the library is also part of your risk management here. Right? A library that's widely used by many people, that has been used by many projects, is less fail than Xenios' free visualization tool that you can download but nobody has ever used. That's going to raise more eyebrows, both in the review process but also in your own testing. But yeah,
right.
So let's transition to different over here.
So speaking of and applications, how does a university prototype to a clinical product? So what happens to the code and what changes have to be made?
So that's a very good question. In terms of, and for example, like National Institute of Health and other funding agencies in the US, they do have grant mechanism, what's called SBIR, like Small Business Innovation Research, Small Business Technology Transfer Research, STTR. And the goal of this small business innovation grants is, when you have an idea that was developed at a university, or it could be a prototype that was developed at a university, to translate that or commercialize that so that it can be used in the for patient care or any other types of use in the real world. So people use that mechanism really well, right? Because there are a lot of great ideas at universities, a lot of very smart students, very visionary. They come up with these great ideas, and they actually build a very good prototype, and they want to commercialize that. So I just wanted to mention that there are all these funding mechanisms that will make that possible. Very good resource to use. Now, but what it's going to take is it depends on involves what we just talked about, which is that research prototype is useful as a proof of concept, right? You're trying to figure out if there is a match between the technology that you've developed and also the market, right? What they call market product fit, right? And that's very useful, because you can take that prototype and then shop it around or show it to different target users and get some good feedback. And that will help you establish the business viability or the business value of that prototype, right? But now, in terms of the software, you usually, you might not have to start from scratch, but it's going to require a significant rewriting and refactoring. And the reason being, you have to now put together the software testing specification, requirements, the design controls we just talked about. And that has to be done a lot from from a component perspective. Obviously, it depends how complex your software application is. So you'll have to do that. The documentation is a big one, right? There's a lot of, especially if you're thinking about submitting this to FDA for regulatory approval, it requires a lot of documentation. And then the second thing I'll mention is validation is critical, like clinical validation, right? So obviously that prototype, there's some market need. You see some potential that it can be useful, but then you need to actually validate that with real patients, right? And if it's for patient care, you have to figure out a way to find clinical collaborators and then design studies that obviously have to be approved using IRB and all kind of approvals. So that will be also a critical part of the validation. And then the last thing I want to, it's kind of related to the first thing I mentioned about the business viability, is the whole point of user interface and user experience is critical, right? So you might have the kind of earth-shattering and amazing image segmentation or registration algorithm, but if your target user is a radiologist, or even let's even make it even harder, a surgeon who has 10 seconds of attention to look at your results, your UI has to be really good. It has to be something the surgeon would take a look at and say, hey, yeah, I got it. So there's a whole process that's involved in what we call usability study, like human subject study, usability study with the target users. So those are the things I would think about. And then obviously the things we talked about, cybersecurity, and also related to usability is also accuracy, right? That's also huge, right? So if you're building, let's say, a computer aided detection algorithm, and it worked really well, like 95% on your well, on a data that was already cleaned, already came from a particular institution, but that's 95% on that very very clean data. But then when you take it out on the real world, you have to be dealing with all kind of different data, different types of data, and if you're looking at data coming from different modalities have different acquisition protocol and all those type of things. So as part of that translation, as part of that commercialization, your software has to be tested how well it will do when used in the real world with real patients and real patient data.
As I was listening to you speak, it never hit me quite this way, is that the prototype is a little bit like a student graduating, right? It has transferable skills. So you have established something that works, you have learned how to do certain things, and that is your prototype. But now you're starting a new job when you move to industry effectively. And so some of the skills will transfer over, but maybe not everything the way you did transfer over. And so you will start from scratch and sort of digest what you in the same way that you take what you learn at the university and apply it to a job. So it hit me as sort of an analogy as I heard you speak.
Yeah. So, but also, these days, a lot of this university coursework, they do have external collaboration, like industry collaborators, and those are really good in the sense that you're going to be working on a project or in a capstone project with a real world implications or real world usage. And I think I know Zenos, you're very well involved with Mackay and a lot of these conferences. Grand challenges are really good way of helping people train their, let's say, machine learning algorithm, you have this data there. But one of the issue with the grant challenges is it's highly curated, it's almost like the Kaggle competition, right? That type of the data that you get there it's not the real world data. I mean, the real world data, I mean, a lot of even deep learning and machine learning, you actually spend 75, 80% of your time cleaning the data. And that's kind of the real world work. And you spend whatever, 10, 15, 20% of your time on the kind of the fun part of training the machine learning model and things like that. So there is that part of it as well is, having your algorithm, your prototype is important, but then dealing with real world data is also kind of a whole new experience for new graduates from universities.
I have a quick clarifying question. So you've mentioned open source code and open data. Can you explain the difference between the two and what requires maintenance and regulation?
No, that's a very good question. In many ways, as I was just mentioning to Zenos, this Mackay conference, they have these grand challenges where they make data available. And so, and then it's been amazing to witness actually the last 15, 10 years. I'm sure Zenius would attest to this, is there's a lot of push for, even from NIH perspective, if you have a research project where you received grant funding to generate data, that data should be publicly accessible, right? So that's the whole idea of open data, right? The data that you used in your research should be shared with the research community. Now the advantage there is, now you can kind of getting the full ecosystem. So you have your software, which is open source. So for example, if I write a journal paper claiming this amazing accuracy, then I'm going to now point people to the software that I used, my implementation, which is huge, right? Because now you're talking about reproducibility, right? So, I'm not just, doing cherry picking of a couple really nice data and then had this amazing accuracy and wrote this journal paper and everybody got excited about it. But I'm also sharing my implementation so other people can, check out, clone my repository and then take a look at now. But then nobody can do anything about it if it's just open source software, right? They need the data. Okay, they need my data so that you can compare apple to apple. So now data is also being available. So in many ways, so the fact that you can share your software implementation, you can also share your data, in some ways also share the way you're doing the evaluation, which is important, right? Especially in a lot of these studies, when you talk about performance, what also matters is, okay, what's your evaluation strategy, right? How did you do your training, testing, and validation? That's critical. So in many ways, in my eyes, if you can share your open source software, your data, and how you did the evaluation, then that makes it an open science, a reproducible science, right? So people can actually be able to get access to all that, and then they can actually try it on their own, and that makes it hugely important. It stimulates collaboration, and that's another part that we probably haven't mentioned is, imagine I'm at Yale and I've got my software, I got my data, I got my evaluation, and you put that on GitHub, right? And then on the other side of the country, let's say Stanford, a graduate student can check out all that data and the software and everything. They can try it on, but the first thing they will do if they run into an issue is they'll reach out to the main contributor from Yale, right? And there's conversations happening because nobody is hiding anything. Everything is out on the open. And that stimulates collaborations and working together. And then you can jointly go apply for grant funding from NIH and you get more resource. With that resource, you're going to continue to build on what's already available. So that just stimulates and all kind of collaborations, and that's a huge part of everything we do in science. And so again, just it's something, it was just so satisfying for me to see in my short career, because when I was in grad school, and I had like 100 cases I was using for my PhD work. That was like gold mine for my advisor. He, it's like, all right, 100 cases. Okay, let's just work on these 100 cases. And it was so hard to get more cases from other research groups, because that culture of sharing was not there, because everybody's like, oh, I got my 50 cases. I got to write paper, but I'm not sharing with anyone. Not anymore. I mean, it's just unbelievable how now, you write your journal paper, you got all your data, your software, you just put it out there and other people can see it. And then you see NIH releasing thousands and thousands of patient data, like the TCIA, the huge center where they're making available thousands and thousands of cases, all kinds of modalities, CT, MRI, PET CT, for researchers all over the world. It's unbelievable. It's a great time to be involved in medical research and medical software development.
I mean, as a funny aside, for my class, we have data at Yale. It's just so much easier to get data from TCI, the Cancer Imaging Archive, for those who know the full name, for students, because it comes with fewer strings untouched than even our own data, right? We'd have to put them on IRPs. It becomes like a whole work. Like, just go download 30 CTs from there. It's fine. We can do this.
Exactly.
Something that I guess.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, it's good.
Go
But
ahead.
the culture is changing. I mean, obviously, this type of changes takes some time, right? It's also cultural, but it's happening, because especially NIH prodding and encouraging people to share their data, and other administrators would also see the advantage of that, and then I think slowly things will happen.
I guess we'll close on this.
Sure.
It's I keep telling everybody it's 2021, so we have to talk about machine learning at some level,
right.
because our fields are being transformed, whether we like it or not. But I want you to put your software engineer, software designer hat on here, not so much the application hat, and say, okay, what is changing us instead of having this old style segmentation registration? Now we're doing machine learning. What is software process? What do you see as the challenges in this environment? Here, of course, data is going to be even more important almost, but
Yeah, so in many ways, engineering, so almost like the way I look at it, there's machine learning and there's machine learning engineering, right? So I think the last 15, 20 years, and I wouldn't call it 15, like 10, 15 years, there's focus on building new algorithms, right? Getting this highly performing machine. Even now in deep learning, with access to a lot of data and computational resource, people are still a lot of push towards, beating performance, right? Accuracy and all those types. So that's going to continue. But now you see the shift from just science into engineering effort, which is how do you engineer your machine learning based solutions? Okay, so for example, the things like once you put it out there in a medical device product, how do you monitor performance, right? Because you train a particular model and you've got your software out there being used in patient care. The model's gonna is gonna start the performance is gonna start degrading at some point. One, the data is gonna be different, and because obviously modalities are all the medical modalities are changing, and also if you're using that application in a different patient population, different institution, the performance will be not as comparable as when you had it trained and got it all validated and approved by FDA. So that's where you see the engineering aspect will be there. Okay, how do you start putting a process around it? And there's a lot of effort obviously going on, by the big companies around the world, where you put a process behind it, right? So you sort of use the software engineering expertise, because software engineering is, software is never done, right? It's never completed. The same way machine learning product is never done. It's never complicated. It's never completed. You have to have this infrastructure for monitoring performance, obviously versioning the data that you use to train it, even your implementation, and then to have this feedback mechanism to, iteratively, continuously improve your models based on the data that you get from the real world. So, and that's, and that's what's going to take, I guess, to answer your question, Xenios, is the fact that you have these algorithms that are producing an amazing accuracy, amazing performance. We still need to put on our engineering hat and make sure we monitor the performance on the real world, but then we can continuously improve the performance of the algorithms.
So we've gone for a while. I don't want
Sure.
to do forever, but one more chance. Is there anything you'd like to say? Is there anything that you advise for students, or anything?
Yeah, so
mentioned that was in your mind to say, and the questions never got there.
No, I mean, I really enjoyed participating in this, and thank you for doing this course, because in many ways you guys are also opening the the secret or the complexity of medical device software development, right? It's not, in many ways, you're kind of hitting on the critical aspects of medical device software development, and then understanding what are the things people can do, students especially can do, if they're interested in being involved in the medical device sector, understanding all the different aspects. And also, obviously, from my perspective and Kitware's perspective, open source software has a huge value in it, right? And I, again, we touched on this throughout our conversation. I really encourage students to work on those open source softwares while they're doing their schooling, right? Their coursework, right? In many ways, obviously getting the project done and grades and coursework is important, but imagine if you use a particular software library that is going to be so valuable to you after you graduate, while you were while you were at school, at university. Then when you graduate, you've already gotten a lot of experience and expertise that would be very, very useful in the real world. So really, taking advantage of the opportunities. Obviously now these type of opportunities are always there in all different universities, where people can work on all these different difficult problems, because there's software, there's open data. It will be huge. And then the last thing I would mention is the medical industry is a very highly regulated industry, right? Because it's mission critical. You're talking about patient management. And I think it's also important for students to understand and understand and appreciate the rigor that it takes to get a prototype, from a university course all the way to the clinic. There is a lot of processes that are involved, a lot of hard work that are involved by a lot of very smart people to take that prototype all the way to patient care. And one that makes you really be confident about the care that we get when we go to hospitals or to the clinic is the types of software and medical device our care providers are using has gone through a lot of rigorous testing validation. So that's really very gratifying to know that. And also at the same time, I want to encourage students to have that huge reservoir of patience and perseverance, because it takes there's always excitement at the beginning when you have a prototype that's going to tackle some major healthcare problem, but it takes a lot of effort to get it all out there. So that, I think having that mindset of you're working on this very interesting problem, but also having the understanding that it's going to require a lot of effort, it makes a huge difference. And then when you get into it, you won't be I wouldn't say turned off, or you won't really despair right away. You actually know that it's going to take a while, but you're ready for it. Your mindset is ready for it, and that usually helps a lot.
Yeah, Andinet, thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you.
All right.
And I look forward to talking some more in the future. Take care.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.